This paper explores how the theoretical modes of late post-structuralist thought can inform the reading of environmental crisis texts. In particular, I engage with the ethical turn found among others in Michel Foucault with his Technologies of the Self, and Judith Butler's use of performativity, also including the Levinasian moment, wherein one's ethical relation to other is conceived as prior to one's ontological relation to self. Authors writing within the ambit of an environmental crisis mode, intentionally or not, have on some level to engage with the contemporary conundrum of what to do about the human as being in the world, where we discover that something about our humanness has failed the world so profoundly. This collapse holds us up to a notably reflexive moment in history, one in which external frames of reference can no longer be relied on. The post-structuralist decentering of the human subject, together with its disregard of interiority, can seem unsettling. Yet the value of such decentering is its positioning of the human subject in such a way that makes it available for reconsideration, in both ontological terms and in terms of its ethical relationality to the world. Late post-structuralist thinking in this sense is a viable critical tool that can support contemporary ecological thinking in an investigational mode. Reading Margaret Atwood's two simultaneous works of speculative fiction, Oryx and Crake and The Year of the Flood, I focus on Atwood's interest in the problem of the human imagination, on the face of things a decidedly interior quality, which in these two novels she explores by positioning it variously within the discursive field of environmental crisis discourse. Atwood adds a substratum layer to her human in crisis with environment by linking the problem of the human imagination to a further, somewhat more covert discourse, that of the human fear in the face of death, as relational to environmental crisis. Here, our ability to imagine our deaths is perceived to induce our pursuit of immortality, leading in turn to an apocalyptic annihilation of other. From a postmodernist standpoint, this discourse can be viewed as emerging in response to the progressive quest of modernity to free humanity from the constraints of the natural world, giving rise to an evacuation of nature and death from the self. One cannot evacuate part of the self and expect it to stay evacuated. Hence, a rebounding of death and nature upon the self renders environmental crisis inevitable. In engaging with such a discourse, Atwood stretches the ontological subject under examination to full reach, by which what emerges is the suggestion of how a performatively ethical subject might be conceived. I trace the root of this use of imagination through the narratives of the two texts via three key characters. Firstly, Crake, in whom a dualistic imagination is linked to Atwood's dismissal of post-humanist possibilities. Secondly, Snowman, in whom imagination appears to resolve dualistic thinking, yet who fails to respond ethically to other. And finally, Toby, in whom imagination comes to be invested with what Eric Darrier would describe as a Foucauldian non-strategic ethic, relying on a reflexive rather than normalizing morality. There has been a tendency to simplify Atwood's ambiguous strategies, with Snowman becoming the hero of the humanities and Crake the evil mad scientist. Danette DiMarco, for example, sees Snowman as offering the site for change. My reading is closer to Bergtoller's, who sees half solutions in Snowman and Crake. What this investigation via the discourse of death brings forward is the potential offered by the character Toby, whose reflexive mode repositions the human subject in an interesting way. The two texts work within the same time frame, but through different characters, and revolve around the same narrative event, Crake's destruction of the human species. The human fear of death plays a formative role in each text's response to this one event. The first text, Oryx and Crake, opens into a post-apocalyptic, climate-changing world and introduces Snowman, lone survivor who has witnessed the elimination of the human race. We gradually discover that the author of this devastation was his good friend Crake, top-shot scientist, whose life's work, the Immortality Project, involved the distribution of a deadly virus to eliminate humanity, to be replaced with his genetically improved version, the Crakers. Believing that humanity's failures towards both the planet and themselves were a consequence of the human fear in the face of death, in designing his new species, Craik's objective was to overcome this by removing the imagination. While the reader is ultimately left to decide whether such a purging of the human race from the planet is intended as an appropriate response to environmental crisis or the ultimate disaster, the second text, The Year of the Flood, addresses the issue from quite a different perspective, bringing forward the idea that by learning to face death from the outset, as explored in the character Toby, such failings as Craik sought to remedy might instead be avoided. Thus, Atwood offers two kinds of formula for the retaming of death in the face of environmental crisis, one post-humanist and the other humanist, framed within an exploration of human imagination as revealed through her characters. The first character to consider is Craik, author of the key narrative event, the destruction of humanity, around which both texts revolve. Craik is in many ways the classic utilitarian, making a dispassionate, if appalling, decision to destroy humanity for the greater long-term good of both the planet and his new human species, the Craikers, on essentially populationist grounds. However, as Bowson also notes, and while it is not stated as such, Craik is portrayed as having Asperger's syndrome. I work with Asperger's and have been struck by the accuracy of this portrayal. In diagnosis of this spectrum condition, with its autism at one end and high functioning levels at the other, a pattern of character traits is observed, one of these being a lack of social imagination. Craik's Aspergic profile takes on significance as he hones in on the human imagination in relation to the human fear of death as a key cause of human suffering and environmental degradation. Craik himself is not afraid of death, as we find out in various ways, and through eradicating imagination in the Craikers, his intention is to render them immortal. Immortality, he states, is a concept. If you take mortality as being not death, but the foreknowledge of it and the fear of it, then immortality is the absence of such fear. In this, Craik contrasts non-human animals as living natural, immortal lives with mortal humans whose imaginations lead to our failures towards both human and environment. In having their imaginations removed, the Craikers will be humans with the animal forced back into them, no longer differentiated from other species by any mortal status. Instead, being driven to extremes of behaviour by fear in the face of death, they will live their lives naturally, They will live their lives smoothly, following genetically coded patterns of reproduction and causing no harm to the planet. While, as Bergthaler suggests, Craik's desire to halt humanity's problematic behaviours should not be too easily dismissed, his act of annihilation fulfills the dialectic function in the discourse of evacuated death that rebounds. In forcing the animal back into the human, he acknowledges the dualism he seeks to avoid. That the Craikers' imaginations start to emerge undercuts the notion that imagination can be severed as though it was some separate thing. Thus, Craik's solution to the human fear of death as relational to environmental crisis fails in a number of ways. However, he does ensure that Snowman will survive, caretaker to his Craikers, in the post-apocalyptic world. Snowman can be contrasted to Craik in his valuing of human imagination. Where Craik sought to force the animal back into the human, Snowman, with his imagination, offers an alternative means to achieve the same end. Snowman is a lover of the arts and of words, forced to endure the agony of the post-apocalyptic moment. As the edifices of humanity crumble, Snowman finds that his words crumble too. Stripped of contextualizing other, but barely able to maintain a semblance of self, he clings to the broken artifacts of civilization strewn around him. Snowman at this stage is no animal. However, as time passes, he struggles to hold on to his humanness. Sometimes he laughs like a hyena, or roars like a lion, and like a primate he takes sanctuary in the trees. His attachment to the broken artifacts around him gradually loosens, and with no need for genetic modification, Snowman begins to encounter the animal within. The boundaries that previously defined his human self are redefining, realigning him with the world within which he emerges. One can also discern the emergence of a bodily performative in the nuances of Atwood's descriptions of Snowman's transformation. As his post-apocalyptic aloneness intensifies, a certain pseudo-presence of other slides up around him, so that, as often he feels he has a listener, someone unseen hidden behind the screen of leaves, watching him slyly. This conjuring up of other highlights the performative aspect of our being in the world, our existence as always already here, within a world that has somehow contained our arrival. It also reminds us that the presence of a listener is always a possibility. As Butler remarks, it would seem that one is always addressed in one way or another, even if one is abandoned or abused, since the void and injury hail one in specific ways. Gradually, as Snowman is hailed by this void of apocalypse, he comes to accept it as the other within which he is contained. It seems it is only when he is able to reformulate this other that he is able to re-enter or arrive at the present as an in-the-world being. So here it is then, he observes, the moment, this one, the one he's supposed to be living in. His head's on a hard surface, his body's crammed into a chair, he's one big spasm, he stretches and yelps with pain. This moment of arrival has resonance with our experience of environmental crisis, where Snowman's existential pain touches the pain of our own realizations. Adeline John Spoocher warns of the dangers of apocalypse fiction over-fetishizing destruction, placing the subject in a situation that becomes existentially intolerable. Snowman does at least achieve this arrival, but it has taken him most of the first text to achieve. Emerging from the experience he describes as living inside Craig's nightmares, like one of Tim Morton's hyperobjects, impossible to grasp because we're inside it. Such a moment of painful arrival can also be viewed within the framework of a Butlerian bodily performative, in particular in her later work, where she constructs the formulation of the subject in conjunction with ideas from Adorno and Levinas. Firstly, through this arrival into being, a kind of violence occurs upon the self, as is apparent in this portrayal of Snowman. In relation to this, Butler suggests that the way we respond to injury may offer a chance to elaborate an ethical perspective and even become human. Working from Levinas, Butler then adds to this violence of arrival the arrival of responsibility. Hence our violent performative arrival in the world, as depicted by Snowman, already infers the need for our ethical response. Yet Snowman seems to lack the resources to sustain the possibilities that arise here, although he points towards a performative ethic that will materialize in Toby. Snowman's shortcomings might be understood in his consenting to a deterministic view of life. He remembers, for example, a saying, which he thinks he might have written: "Each one of us must tread the path laid out before him," a sentiment that fails to engage his imagination with any ethical or generative way forward. In The Year of the Flood, Atwood really develops a humanist version of the retaming of death. Where Craig sought to immobilize the fear of death using a technological fix, here the idea is put forward that the human, using what Foucault would call technologies of the self, can transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality. The transformation that is sought in this case is that of the full recognition of one's own mortal state. By overcoming one's fear of death, the self acquires the capacity to take a more ethical stance to living, which potentially might reduce human impact on the natural world. Sylva Baubank describes Foucault's writings as opening up the possibility of a practical freedom, a freedom not of action, nor of intentions and desires, but of a choice of a mode of being. Where Snowman's mode of being is deterministic, Toby's takes its cue from the teachings of Atwood's eco-cult, the God's Gardeners, whom she encounters within the analeptic build-up to a prophesied waterless flood, Craig's act, of course. The God's Gardeners combine a pantheistic Judeo-Christianity with the natural sciences and teach an Epicurean view of death. it is nothing to be afraid of. In a solemn ceremony, Adam 1 reads, "Let us pray that if we must sacrifice our own protein, so it may circulate among our fellow species, we will recognize the sacred nature of the transaction. Should your life be required of you, rest assured that it is required by life. Let us sing." Atwood also sets the gardeners within a mode of the linguistic performative, their teachings involving practices of naming and repetition, viewable in terms of Foucault's technologies of the self. The importance of death as part of a cycle of life is drummed into the gardeners from a young age. The gardeners also teach that you create your own world by your inner attitude, a very different engagement with the imagination to that of Snowman, and one that renders the subject's relationality to its world dynamic. The result of all this for Toby is that when it comes to the apocalyptic moment, which she also survives, as do most of the gods' gardeners, she responds quite differently to Snowman. Where his arrival does not occur until late in the first text, Toby in the year of the flood rallies almost at once. In considering this more dynamic relationality of self and environment, one can draw links between the work of Butler and Levinas and that of Elizabeth Gross and Karen Barad, as does Vicky Bell, who connects cultural with ecological survival via the notion that matter is itself agential and performatively interactive, a route that also revises the interiority issue in Butler's work. However, where matter, agency and human imagination collide, the ethical problem is then posed, as Atwood seems well aware. For in an interview she states, "Understanding the imagination is no longer a pastime but a necessity, because increasingly if we can imagine it, we'll be able to do it. In our freedom to choose a mode of being in the Foucauldian sense, we become free therefore to choose our ethical mode, as was Craik, who destroyed humanity via the techniques of bioengineering." Lastly then, I want to show how Atwood's use of the discourse of death as relational to environmental crisis, when viewed through the Levinasian mode as already described, overcomes this problem by resetting an ethico-performative self within the frame of an ecological paradigm. After Craik's act, The Waterless Flood, Toby, journeying with Wren, comes across one of their gardener friends, Oates, who has been slaughtered and hung in a tree. Wren wants to stop and perform a burial, but Toby insists that they move on, focusing on biological survival. At the same time, Atwood sets up an alignment between Oates's death and that of Lawrence Titus Oates of the Scots expedition, reminding us of his famous words, "I am just going outside and maybe some time." This double death of Oates can be viewed under the terms of Levinas's claim that the ethical relation with the other is prior to the ontological relation with self. Sacrifice, of course, tends to be a loaded term. We might assume it to infer here that the human race should make itself scarce, allowing the natural world to recover, as in Craik's act. However, where the ethical relation to other is prior to the ontological relation to self, sacrifice might actually mean acknowledging this relation between the self and the world. That is, positioning the life of the self ethically within the wider context of the world within which it dwells. In this sense, it is performatively the case that in order to disable the dialectic of rebounding death and environmental crisis, our ethical response is required. To conclude, in her second humanistic route towards addressing the human fear in the face of death, Atwood seems to suggest that death does need to be retamed, that this retaming might most appropriately occur in the subject that engages non-dualistically with its animal or simply biological self, discovers a reflexive means to re-engage the imagination in a generative mode, and acknowledges that immortality exists in the life most able to respond ethically to other.